I'm going to introduce our speaker. We have Dr. Robert Potter here, and we're going to be talking about the chemical correction of the broken brain. So Dr. Potter's professional life has combined medical practice, teaching, and bioethics consultation. He practiced internal medicine and geriatrics while teaching for the University of Kansas School of Medicine and OHSU from 2004 to 2015. He's board certified in internal medicine and geriatrics and has been elected as Fellow of the American College of Physicians. Dr. Potter also holds a PhD in religion, psychology, and ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School. From 1994 until his retirement in 2004, he was a bioethics scholar, instructor, and consultant for the Center of Ethics in Healthcare at OHSU. Dr. Potter served as scientific advisor for the AAAS Science for Seminaries project to increase scientific content and theological education at Multnomah Biblical Seminary, and is a frequent advisor and contributor to New Wine events. All right.
Hi, everyone. Well, listen, we're not going to be a big group, and so, when the time comes, we don't really have a chat room option here. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you want to ask a question, I don't mind being interrupted, okay? I can find my way back. I got my notes up here to the right, so if I get lost, I can always refer to those. So if you want to, interrupt me and say, hey, Potter, what do you mean by that? Or please do that, okay? That'll make it our conversation rather than my lecture. I can lecture unlimited periods of time, okay? That's not a problem for me. But I'm going to look at how the brain chemistry works, and then what happens when it doesn't work, and then what can you do to make it work again, okay? That's what I'm out to do here. Now, that means that I'm concentrating here on what we call organic mental illness. The kind of mental illness that you usually see a list like, schizophrenia, bipolar, that kind of stuff, okay? And I'm not here so concerned about that reactional depression that happens when your favorite dog dies. That's important. Don't get me wrong about that. Relational ruptures are a huge problem for mental health. But I'm talking about that which we call disease or illness or dysfunction or given a number of other names. So I'm talking about the brain chemistry. I like to think of the brain as a chemical communication network. We think of the brain as sort of electrical, and in a technical sense, there's a change of positive, negative electrons and so on, but it's not really chemical like your house is wired for electricity. It's chemical in the sense that chemicals cause things to happen, okay? The neurons, of which there are about 10 billion in every brain. I've got a few less than some of you younger people but for the most part, we got about 10 billion neurons. But here's the deal. Each neuron has on average 500,000 connections to other neurons. Now, I don't know how to do the math, but when you take 10 billion and multiply it by 500,000, you got a whole lot of stuff. And so the chemical network that's going on up here is gigantic. Now, the neuron itself is made up of a nucleus, it's a not quite fist size, but look, and then an axion that draws out from it. And connected to this are what we call dendrites. These are little connections that are picking up connections to the 500,000 other neurons. Now, down that axon doesn't travel electricity, but rather The cell wall is made up of one chemical on one side and another chemical on the other side. And when it is stimulated, the chemicals trade places. And that chemical that's positively charged with an electron shifts in and the negative shifts out. And that shifting travels down the axon at tremendous speeds. We've measured the speed of this chemical transmission along axons, and it's just astronomically fast. Now, if you get an axon a meter long, which you can find in some animals, and we have one that's about 2 feet long, by the time it goes down there, you're talking about like 0.03 milliseconds. We're talking fast. But at the end of that axon is a little cluster of cells. And that cluster of cells has chemicals in it that are released at the end of the axon. There is actually a gap between that axon and the dendrite of the next cell. That gap is visible on electron microscopes. It is literally there. And across that gap are released what are called neurotransmitter chemicals. Those chemicals stimulate the next cell. And on it goes throughout the network. This interactive matrix of cells is constantly going on. It doesn't just sit there, and you press a button and suddenly it starts up. It's going on all the time. And if you've got a network of cells that is holding a memory, that is constantly happening. Roger Penfield, a great neurosurgeon from Canada, began to work in the 1990s with patients who had their brain opened and they were conscious. And he would stick an electrode in certain areas and record what was going on. And the patient would tell him, "Oh, I just heard my mother call me to supper." That's spooky stuff, people. That your mother calling you to supper is still going on in your brain. That's still circulating down there in what we call the deep or long-term memory. That blows my mind, whatever mind is. But it's all a chemical process. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. It's a chemical process that carries information, okay? And whenever there's a new stimulus that comes into our body, say I look out the window and see a crow flying off the light pole right there, that stimulus comes into me. That's carried along all the axons that carry it up into my memory bank. And that image is hooked up with all the crows I've ever seen, I guess, or something like that. And I interpret, what's that about? Then I see the crow has a nut in its claw, and it's cracking the nut on the light pole. I'm seeing something happening, and I interpret what that's about. My brain is processing information, okay? And when my brain processes the information correctly, I see a crow cracking a nut. When my brain does not interpret the information properly, when I do not see reality for what it is, I technically am psychotic. I am mentally ill. I cannot interpret reality correctly. And if you can't interpret reality correctly, that means something is broken in the system. And the system of interaction, this chemical interaction, is just constantly going on. Constantly going on. There's a variety of things that can affect that synapse. The synapse is primarily where the problems go wrong, okay? That's the way we think about the brain anyway. The synapse is the big deal. Obviously, the nerve cell and all that what goes on there is important, but the real piece is a connection of one cell to another that keeps an image constantly alive in your brain as it circulates around. So the things that can interfere with that transmission of information is, as I say, a breakdown in the chemistry. So what causes the chemistry to break down? We are pretty aware that there are some genetic factors not yet well worked out, okay, not well worked out, but genetic factors that cause it. There are some kind of chemical interruption. And the chemicals that are some internal chemicals like hormone, like thyroid, or corticosteroids, or estrogens and testosterone. All of those can interfere with the chemical intervention. But there are lots of other environmental factors that can do that, and we'll talk about those more in detail a little bit. Now, for you and I, we look at this incredible construction called brain, which, let's reduce it down to being a chemical communicator, okay? And God called it good. Or for most of it's more or less good, and I mean, it works most of the time, or much of the time. We work sometimes, we'd like to have a little more mental power maybe. But I think we need to recognize that nature is good, but not perfect. There's a difference between good, workable, and not perfect. Because there are conditions in which the nature of our chemical transmission simply does not work well enough to keep us oriented in the world, okay? Now, let's look at these neurotransmitters just a little more in detail. You'll recognize some of these names. Epinephrine, you know, we all know that epinephrine, the other name for epinephrine is adrenaline, okay? We might get an epinephrine shot if we've got an allergic reaction. You know, maybe if some of us are so allergic to bees that we carry an epinephrine dose with us. So if we get hit by a bee, we take an epinephrine dose. Well, it's got multiple functions in the body, but one of the key functions of epinephrine and its chemical cousin, norepinephrine, is to work as a neurotransmitter primarily in what we call the autonomic nervous system. That part of our nervous system that keeps us breathing and keeps our intestinal tract working and things of that sort of the automatic functions of our body, not the things that we intentionally do, you know, like play the piano and so on. They're primarily working as neurotransmitters, and they're pretty reliable. This is the kind of stuff that doesn't get out of whack very often. On the other hand, you could get too much of it. If you get a shot of epinephrine, you feel wired, boy, and you feel like you're about to fly to the moon. And if you got a lot of epinephrine all the time, you know, it could make you feel crazy and act crazy as well. But it's not typical. It's not thought of as one of the mechanisms of mental disorder. Okay, it's not thought of there. Now, the next one is called serotonin, serotonin, serotonin. This one is really important. It's a primary neurotransmitter, and if you don't have enough of this floating around in your brain, you got big troubles. It has a lot to do with the sleep-wake cycles, appetite, pain sensitivity, our moods. People who are depressed it's often thought that this is the primary problem is a deficiency in serotonin, although that's difficult to scientifically demonstrate, but that's what we think of. It's a big time chemical in our brain. And the more serotonin we got, the better things are. The happier the mood is, okay? So we're looking for serotonin, anything that builds up the serotonin. And just, we'll talk about it a little more in a minute, but just as a side right now, many of the antidepressant drugs are those that will increase the amount of serotonin produced in the brain. Okay, that's the chemical mechanism that we use to deal with depression. So think of serotonin as one of the key chemicals. The next one is called oxytocin. I'll spell it OXYTOCIN. We think of all kinds of funny names for things, you know. We just make it difficult. If you've had Latin and Greek, it helps to go to medical school, but you don't have to. The fact that I was a Latin scholar in high school, I call myself a Latin scholar because I was president of the Latin club, but I'm not sure that qualifies me as a Latin scholar. But, you know, I really took the Latin. I loved it, you know, and it changed the way I look at language generally. And it really helped in medical school, I'll have to admit. I tried 6 times to do Greek and I never could get past the grammar. So I not enough of that. Anyway, oxytocin. This is the chemical that we know deals with attachment and bonding. With experimental studies in animals, we know when we get rid of the oxytocin in a new mother with a newborn, they do not bond. Put the oxytocin back in the body and they begin to bond. We know that this one is really functioning. I think, and many who look to apply these things really think of oxytocin as that chemical, which is at the root of what we would call empathy, the capacity to understand where another person is. Call it the groundwork for love even, okay? So oxytocin, big neurotransmitter. And without it, our lives as humans would be greatly reduced. Another one, dopamine, D-O-P-A-M-I-N-E. Multiple effects. In general, it sort of increases the speed and capacity for this synaptic connection. When I say synaptic connection, I'm talking about the chemicals being released from their storage space so that they can pass through this synaptic gap and stimulate the next cell. Okay, dopamine seems to facilitate that chemical transmission. Once again, to make the point that the brain is a big chemical stew, you know, and as long as it's stewing along, bubbling up, we're doing okay in our brains. But the chemicals are so important. Now, there are about 80 other known chemicals, and I don't know what they are. You know, I stopped reading this stuff about 20 years ago, so I pick up a little bit of it, but I'm actually kind of ignorant when it comes to the current. I've stayed up kind of with the neuroscience of things, but this stuff is too complicated for my feeble mind from Kansas. But they're there. We know there's lots of them, and we know that they're really working. Now, where do they come from? Where is this epinephrine and this serotonin and this oxytocin and dopamine? Well, they come from elements in our diet. They are produced by organs other than the brain, and they're built in the brain. The body is all fixed up. It's designed to make these chemicals be present and be ready to work. Okay, and keeping that balance is illustrated by a word. There you go, comes out of the Latin. It was invented in about 1936 by a famous physiologist named Walter Cannon. He said, The ideal of the human body is homeostasis. Homeostasis is our fancy word meaning it stays in the same place. It's in balance. There's not an excess. There's not a deficiency. It stays in balance. And that's what we're after. Any questions about lecturette number 1, guys and gals? Anything you want to throw in your own knowledge and say, oh, Potter, I think you're all wet there. I like that, by the way. I can just turn you off, of course. I can mute you anytime I want to. No big questions right now, huh? Okay, then I'll go on. Because, even though that's complex stuff, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's important to imagine that what is happening in our brains is chemical interactions that are designed to make things work right. Now, I want to add, that I'm not a reductionist as Paul Metzger would accuse me of saying the brain's nothing but chemicals, or that our mind is nothing but chemicals. But I'm going to have to say, without the chemicals floating around, you don't have much to go on. You're not just a mind wandering out there by itself. And in my judgment, you're not a spirit just sort of floating around in the air. Without a brain, you don't have much going for you, okay? The brain is the basis. Mind and spirit emerge from the function of the brain, and that's another topic for another day in another setting. Okay, what causes this not to work? Well, as I said, first of all, that genetics is in there. Now, genetics is not an absolute either. I mean, you can have a genetic mother, and you can have a gene that aims towards schizophrenia. I mean, what did I say? I said a genetic mother. Your mother could have schizophrenia, and your genes could aim towards schizophrenia. But for it to be expressed, other things have to happen. Things that seem to be in the environment, things that have to be in the relationships in which you exist. We don't know. We do not know what sets off a psychotic episode in someone who has the tendency to schizophrenia. We don't know what it is that sets off the genetics. But we do know that genetics has an influence. It's not determinate always. Sometimes it's very dominant, but it's not totally the cause, okay? So think of genetics as being there, sort of built into the structure of your body, of your brain. But exactly how the genetics works is yet a mystery. There's some fellas and gals working hard on that, and maybe someday, way after I'm gone, they'll figure it out. Now, look at the neuron. If you get neurons injured, some of them killed off so that this network is not a perfect network, maybe out of a few 100,000 cells, a couple of 300 of them get knocked off with injury, blow to the head or something. Yeah, that's going to affect the function of that network that's trying to process the information. And it's going to be out of whack. It's not going to be homeostatic. So trauma of any kind is going to do that. And stroke is another. Stroke is simply means that something interferes with the circulation and some of the cells die. And that can be a blockage of an artery, or even a tiny arteriole, or even a capillary, and knock off a few thousand neurons. Or it could be a stroke that takes half of the brain. And we talk about the little strokes that can change a person's mental capacity. And dementia, of course, we think of commonly as the little strokes that happen over and over again. But you take the big stroke, and what do you get? You get a change in personality. You get what you could technically call a mental disorder, couldn't you? The person, my grandfather, my father's father, small town guy, head of everything, local judge, teaches all the time, elder in his church. After he had a stroke, he reverted to speaking like a sailor. His vocabulary seemed to grow greatly toward the obscene. And everybody both laughed and felt sorry for it when Robert J. Potter walked down Main Street in Hamilton, Missouri, because you'll likely be greeted with some obscenity. But that's a change in personality, isn't it? From stroke. Well, okay, infection will do it. There's a lot of brain infection. We're up against this COVID thing now. We don't know how much long-term effect COVID will have on brain cells and then on personality as time evolves. We do not know that. What we're very confident of is that many people who had the influenza 100 years ago evolved over a period of years into a dementia-like or a personality abnormality that thought to be traced to that influenza infection which had caused trouble in the brain 30 years ago. Those are difficult things to prove with accuracy, but we do know that when people have particularly viral infections of the brain, there is a definite change, or can be a definite change in personality when they survive and come back to function capacity. Hormone imbalances can be very, very strong to upset personality. When somebody comes into my office complaining of anxiety, the first thing I check is their thyroid level. If you're hyperthyroid, you're going to be an anxious, nervous person, okay? And so there are personality disorders that you can directly link to hormone imbalance. I wouldn't want to dwell on it, but the old postmenopausal syndrome, for women as there's a shift in estrogens, can create a lot of psychological distress, whether it's depression, anxiety, paranoid ideations. It is a very difficult period of time for many women as they go through the brain changes that are accompanying the hormonal changes in their body. There are a lot of drugs, and when I say the word drugs, I'm not talking about street drugs. I'm talking about medications primarily. And there are a lot of medications that will cause this. 5 years ago, I was experiencing what I thought was pretty clearly a depression. And I didn't understand it quite. I sort of blamed it on the fact that I just turned 77 and I was beginning to ponder my own mortality. I was seeing my death coming here pretty soon. But as I look back on it, I had started taking a Tylenol PM, 2 of them at bedtime to help with sleep. Tylenol is acetaminophen is a relatively non-toxic chemical. We think of Benadryl, which is the PM part of that, as something that we use for allergy. Shouldn't be any problem. And I used to give it to people repeatedly, innocently. I did a little study, and I discovered that a small but definite portion of people on this innocuous little drug called Benadryl get seriously depleted in what? Serotonin. Serotonin production in the brain is interfered, is disturbed by the presence of Benadryl diphenylhydrazine in the body. Isn't that something? I was taking what I thought was a pretty innocent little chemical, and it was robbing me of my serotonin. I stopped that. I went into some short-term counseling with a pastoral counselor that I know. And, you know, in short order, I was back to my old robust self. But pay attention to the fact that chemicals interfere with chemicals. That's what we got to understand, that we are a chemical machine in our body. And our brain is a concentration of chemicals processing information. And we throw in some other chemicals, gets in the mix. It may help, it may hinder. I always told my patients every medicine was a potential poison because of side effects of one kind or another. And here I learned it for myself, on myself 5-6 years ago. But pay attention to that, you know, every time somebody comes to me saying, oh, I don't feel good, I begin to examine what are they taking for medicines. And, you know, since I did geriatrics, somebody 70 years old comes in with it and they're taking 9 different drugs of some kind. You know, and so pay attention to that. If you're working with somebody and they're saying, oh, I'm feeling depressed, I just don't feel good at all, just can't think right, examine what they're taking. You don't need to be a pharmacologist to understand that lots of different medicines can cause lots of different side effects. So just pay attention to that, okay? Vitamin deficiency is another one that's really subtle and hard to diagnose. But both vitamin A and vitamin B deficiency will produce a lot of abnormalities in this neurotransmitter release and crossing the barrier, the synaptic barrier. So pay attention to that.
Which vitamins did you just say?
Oh, vitamins A and B12 are the ones that I experienced having trouble with. People would take too much vitamin A. That was actually too much vitamin A. But a deficiency of vitamin B12 is really hard on the brain chemical function. I take at my age of 82, I take vitamin B12 supplement 3 times a week. And I can't tell you that makes me any smarter than I was before, but I'm confident that it at least prevents the brain chemistry from being deficient on the basis of not having enough B12, at least. There are other deficiencies going on in my brain. What my point is this, the underlying point is, when I'm talking about organic brain disorder, I'm not talking so much about a psychological problem, a relational problem. I'm talking about a chemical problem that has caused my brain not to be able to process the information to give me an accurate interpretation of the reality around me. So I misinterpret the world in which I'm existing. And once again, you can do that as a psychological problem. That is, the psyche that you're not seeing the world as you ought to. You know, I think of, how is it that I see the world? Oh, I see the world constructed through my understanding of the Christian tradition. And my understanding of the Christian tradition that gives me a particular way of seeing the world, I consider to be a healthy understanding, a healthy interpretation of the world. And when that gets disordered, I can have a lot of psychological dysfunction, but it's not organic, okay? It's not the brain going bad. It's the psychological paradigms that I'm working through, the structures, the patterns that I'm interpreting the world with. That's what's going bad. You got the difference? And I think when we're dealing with mental illness in the church, we need to pay attention to that. Now, last night I made sort of a big deal about we're not understanding the organic part. And somebody made a good comment. It could have been you, Brad. I would expect something like you to say something like this. But what they said was it's a continuum from the organic into the psychological. And I think that's a better way to think of it. And it's even true that that which is organically born can have its psychological elements. That is, a schizophrenic who's having trouble managing his schizophrenia, but is still relatively functional, may have some relational problems with the people that he's living with or the people he's in community with because they don't understand or accept him as he is, okay? So these could be combined. There's a continuum from one to the other. I have an example of that in our church. There's a fellow that's now 26 who is somewhat functional, but he has really pretty significant autism. When we first went to that congregation 16 years ago, when we moved up here from Kansas City, Alan got up in the middle of the service and just started walking around. Nobody seemed the least bit concerned because Alan had been getting up and walking around in that congregation since he was a little kid. He was accepted. He's even got a couple of jobs. Every Thursday, he sorts the bulletins and some other tasks that he does. If he were not accepted, there would be that psychological problem imposed upon his organic problem. Okay, enough said. All right, I think we're back there. Okay, I've talked about the brain chemistry, and I want to offer this as sort of my main thesis. I'm going to read it so I get it right, because I thought it was clever, so I wanted to be sure I get it right. Faulty chemical interaction causes faulty brain function, causes organic mental disorder. Well, I guess that's not as profound as I thought it was, except to say faulty chemical interaction causes organic brain disease. Okay, that's what I want to say. Now, here's a partial list. Does anybody want to comment on my main thesis?
I want you to say it one more time.
Yeah, faulty. I'll bust it down this way. Faulty chemical interaction causes faulty brain function. That's simple, Crystal. You know, my thesis is that what I'm trying to demonstrate here today is it's chemistry, people. It's chemistry that at the basis of what we call organic brain disease. Okay,
Dr.
I'm going to give you, yeah, somebody else?
I wanted to ask a question, just going back a couple minutes.
Yeah.
You were talking about the chemicals that we take into our body, for example. And I'm a therapist, and a lot of my clients take in a lot of THC, and that's to me. I'm no expert, but I assume that has a pretty big impact on their mood and their functioning. But that is such a tough one to talk with them about. It becomes a battle. I'm judging them, or I'm preaching with them, or they talk to their primary care doctor. Same thing. It becomes a battle. And furthermore, they're resistant to taking a serotonin, some sort of an antidepressant. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I just thought I wanted to hear you talk for a sec about THC, because that's a really commonly taken in chemical. And I wonder what you've seen about that or learned about that.
You know, Alan, you got to go back to my history. I did medical school 60 to 64. We knew nothing about psychedelic drugs. They were illegal. They were not researched. We knew nothing. We were taught nothing. Down through my practice life, I've had no interaction with people who are using those, or that I knew were using that. Okay. Since moving out here, I've been a little more aware of it, but I have not done an adequate study to be a real good source for you to think about this. Who else here among us has had experience with this and can speak to what Alan is asking about? How does that fit into the chemistry of our brain? Because I honestly don't know. I have not read an adequate study that tells me where in the chemical stew THC would fit. Yes, Crystal, go ahead.
I don't know how do brain waves relate to the chemistry of our brain, because I know about delta brain waves,
Sure.
slow brain waves, and I know THC increases those.
Yeah. Well, and obviously the brain wave is a sort of summation of the total brain function, and the total brain function is based on all the chemical transmitters. But exactly how that all breaks down in detail, I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I've studied the brainwave function too, Crystal, about alpha, beta, and delta, and so on, because of my work with contemplative studies and hypnosis and biofeedback and things like that, which I'm certified in. So, but for the specific function of where it is that THC is going to function within that chemical stew, I don't have a clue. We know it affects it. You're right about that. We measurably affected. I guess, Alan, what I would want to comment on is, and maybe I'd like to hear from you folks who are users or know or in counseling or counseling people who are users. I'm fascinated, but at the same time leery of quite a movement nowadays for using various psychedelic drugs as therapeutic methods to increase human flourishing.
Well,
that's in the market now. You know, it's out there. Books being written about it. TED lectures given about it. You know, it's out there, and I have no experience with it, but I'm interested in what you all may have had as experience.
I'll just say one more thing about marijuana. I'm a trauma counselor, and when somebody's using marijuana, they can't access the intense emotions that comes with trauma. It separates them from those emotions. It almost provides some dissociation. So when they reduce their use of marijuana, they have to be ready to have more intense emotions.
So it doesn't fix anything. It just gives them a little relief for the moment. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Someone else.
Dr. Potter, I have a question. We've learned so much about the brain over the last few decades, and I grew up at a time when medicine generally thought that the brain couldn't repair itself. And of course, now we understand that neurotransmitters can grow again, can be repaired, and that some kind of physical activity or mental activity, brain activity can do that. I remember that my mom had several strokes in her 80s. And they significantly impaired her ability to speak and to understand things. And her husband, who was a college professor, a PhD in communications, had her doing particular brain activities every single day, day in and day out. And what happened is that it actually significantly restored her ability to speak and understand. Now, that wasn't permanent, and eventually the effect of the strokes led to dementia. But for quite some time, for a couple of years, she had some real significant growth. And I'm wondering what kind of work is being done on how those types of things, whether it's physical activities, whether it's, brain activities, doing, puzzles, brain gym, that type of thing, can have on the brain, and does it have any application to mental illness?
You're absolutely right, Brad. And all I would, from my point of view, what I would say is that the neurons are not restored. It is clear that a neuron that dies cannot repair itself. A neuron that's sick no neurons never regenerate and break into two and make a new neuron. They've lost the genetic material to do that. What happens though, Brad, is exactly what you described. New networks New networks are what we say recruited. They exist. They're not new networks being made, they're always there, but they're recruited to do a new job. So she learned to speak by using a different network of neurons, and that is a fact. I have seen that all of my practice life, that good rehabilitation services can bring back so much. That is absolutely right. Now, its application in diseases other than dementia is uncertain. Take, for instance, the old autism problem, where kids are having trouble learning. You can improve their learning capacity somewhat and improve their behavior somewhat by careful training. And think of training as recruiting new networks to do a job. Networks that weren't there doing a good job are now recruited to do a better job. That's what training is all about. That training is recruiting networks to do a job. If I learn, to crack walnuts carefully, as I did as a child, and if you crack enough walnuts, you can do really a good job of cracking walnuts. And that's, you train the brain that trains the motor cells to function in a certain way so that you can successfully crack walnuts without hurting your thumbs. Yeah, that's what training is all about, is recruiting new networks. And the rehabilitation for speech or even motor movement, of course, there is some limit to that because the motor portion of the brain is limited. And if you get too much damage there, you don't have enough space to recruit. You don't have enough neurons to recruit into another work. But there's a lot of extra stuff up here that we can find a new use for. So you're absolutely right. Well, let's move on a little bit, you guys. We're coming close to the end of the hour, aren't we? When was this over? Help me remember.
We only have a couple minutes left, so if we have like one more question, we can do that, and then.
I've got the stunning conclusion here too.
Oh, there you go. Wrap us up.
Well, listen, you guys, what can be done? We're already talking about that, and obviously, those medicines that help replenish the neurotransmitters are right at the center of it, aren't they? And what Brad brought up about the retraining, right, it's involved in it. Anything that stimulates the brain to function better through its chemistry is going to help. And we got Thorazine and Haldol and Prozac and lithium and Ritalin and all kinds of stuff, as well as other kinds of things like transcranial magnetic resonance and so on. A lot of stuff that can help. But I'm interested in the spiritual dimension as well. Ever since my main teacher, Don Browning at the University of Chicago, introduced me to Stuart Hiltner, his main professor, to the idea of SPUGs. Those are spiritual drugs. The spiritual drugs that I've been working on now, I've developed a few examples. I've got Disparamine, works pretty well. Repentazole is some people, it has some value. Angriax is one of the better ones. Angriax kind of calms down the whole anger thing. I've used that one. But the favorite that most people are using nowadays is Damitol. Yeah, Damitol, that's the one that really is going strong on the market right now. My friends, it's been a pleasure to be with you. I didn't get to every detail that I wanted to get to, but my main point here in the last 30 seconds is number one, the brain's a chemical processor, processes the information. The neurotransmitters, if they're not well, you're not well. There's a lot of things that can be done to improve the neurotransmitters. And you'll want to watch out for that serotonin and that oxytocin and that dopamine and some other primary drugs, primary chemicals in our body. As we find better ways to do that, I think we'll do better with organic mental illness. So Matt's telling us we've got a couple of minutes to go here. Any final comments from anyone? I've done most of the blabbering here. I guess that's what you expected anyway. But thank you, Crystal, for the thank you. Yeah. Okay, well, friends, keep reading about it. There's trustworthy information out there. There's some untrustworthy information, obviously, but keep looking for it. There are researchers constantly on the search for better chemicals to do the job that our Creator has implanted in our brains, the neurotransmitters. If we can find some better ways to make those neurotransmitters function into a homeostasis that keeps us in balance, then our brain and mental function and our spirit will find its peace. It's been my great pleasure to be with you, and I'll bet you we're going to get thrown out of here any minute now.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is really good.
Yep. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, the
Can you
breakout
hear me?
room is going to end soon. And this has been a wonderful time. Thank you for your education and your wisdom on this matter. And then we're going to take a short break and head into session 2.